child. I was from a family who are called Punjabis, but all around me were people who were Pathans. So my parents knew that we are from a different culture. My parents did not speak Pashto, they were not from that culture. But I grew up there, so I learned Pashto and I associated with them. So there was this sort of, like you see here in Canada, the children of immigrants, they can speak English, but the parents speak Greek, they speak Italian, they speak French, but the children know. So my parents would take me to the stores, they will take me to the shopping, they take me there because I could speak Pashto and they could not. So my earliest memories are when I was 3 or 4 years old, and my mother used to be very worried because we lived with the people, a group called Pathans, and my family was from Punjab. So we had a big house, but she would not let me out of the house. There was a big bar and I could not get out. I could hear the children playing in the street, and I'll ask my mother, can I go out? And she was worried. She said, maybe the Pathans might kidnap you. So that feeling of the bar, the closed door, and my feeling kind of caged in the house, that feeling sort of stayed with me, and I feel that was part of my compassion. Anyone behind closed doors, behind the bars, whether they are mental patients in a hospital, whether they are prisoners of conscience, I always associate that with my earliest feelings of being someone who is not allowed to go out and play. My goal, I think the passion always was, how can we decrease human suffering? How can we increase human happiness? How to create a peaceful world? And I believe that inner peace and outer peace, social peace and political peace are all connected. The secular humanists feel that we do not need any organized religion on the basis of that. We could be humanistic, we could have human rights, and we can have humanitarian sort of ideas without any organized religion. So I consider myself a secular humanist. I do not associate with any organized religion or organized faith. I think when I was in Peshawar, I got fascinated with medicine. So I went to medical school. I had difficulties because I was from an immigrant family. So I struggled to get into the medical school. Then after 5 years, I struggled to go to Iran at the time of the Shah because I did not have the money to come to the West. I wanted to study psychiatry. I was struggling financially, socially. So in Iran, I lived for a year, saved enough money to help my family buy the ticket, come to North America. I applied all over the world. I was accepted in Newfoundland, New Zealand, Ireland. I chose Newfoundland, chose Canada. Coming to Newfoundland, staying there for 4 years, was to me a wonderful experience, not only professionally, but personally. I felt that I could leave my past behind and start a new chapter, start a new life. It was a very sort of exhilarating, it was a very inspiring experience for me, that 4 years in Newfoundland. That gave me a new sort of identity, that gave me a new way of looking at things. I sometimes wonder that if I would have stayed in Pakistan, I would have stayed in Peshawar, what would have happened? Because I felt, being a creative person, I feel that creative people are like in a minority. The traditional people are in a majority. So the creative people, some of them struggle with this traditional majority and they have to pay a price. So I felt that I had to pay a price for my beliefs, for my ideals, So Canada for me was a land of freedom. That is where I could live my way. There was no person in Canada who would tell me what I should or should not do. That freedom for me to live my life according to my beliefs, live my life according to my values, associate with people that I want to socialize with. That to me was very special, that was very precious, and that is why leaving my blood family, I created in Canada what I call family of the heart. And to me, that is very unique, very special, and very meaningful for me. I believe that when we were growing up, maybe 50 years ago, the tradition was so strong. Young people, if they challenged, they questioned any authority, the parents, the teachers, the principals, they were considered disobedient, they were considered rebel, they were not really appreciated. I feel that young people today are very sensitive, they are very aware of any injustice, they are aware of any unfairness, they are very aware that anything that does not make sense to them, they question, they challenge, they confront. I believe that those challenges, those confrontations are valid. I think we should appreciate, I think we should ask ourselves to reflect, to review. Unfortunately, some parents, the traditional parents, the conservative teachers, the conservative principals of the institutions, they still want to hold on to that power. I have met in my clinical practice, I met many people in their 40s, 50s, 60s that had never had any sense of direction, they had no meaning in life, and that was partly they came to me. One of the things I suggest to them is if you don't have your own dream, join somebody else who has a dream, somebody else who has a cause, somebody else who has a mission. So join them. And as you join other people with their dream, with their cause, with their ambition, with their ideal, gradually you also find a dream because now you're in the environment with other people who have dream. So I think these dreamers, although some people might think they are, thinking in sort of unrealistic, but I still feel that Margaret Mead said that this society, the world was changed by a small number of people. So there are always small groups who are very passionate, who are very dedicated, who are very committed. So I feel that so I have dreams, so people join me in my dream. And those people who don't have their own dream, I believe or suggest or recommend that they should meet other people and pick 7 people, 8 people with other, and choose the one that you associate more. I believe that every human being has a special gift. And our goal or our wish is to be in touch with that special gift, and that special gift then share with the community. So having one's own dream or joining somebody with a dream makes life far more meaningful, purposeful, and makes it more peaceful.
So a few years ago, my son was in kindergarten when this wave of protests, like very visible protests, hit the news about parents who really didn't want the updated health and physical education curriculum to come into play. And this was curriculum that was not radical by any stretch, but it now at least mentioned the word consent, and it acknowledged the reality and existence of people with diverse gender identities, and that there are families where there are 2 dads, 2 moms, and much more diversity than that. So these are really, really small steps. But there were lots of people very upset and protesting. And I remember going to the schoolyard at pickup and talking to other parents and saying, they don't represent the majority, we know that, and so literally just at pickup while a kid kind of swings you in circles, we said, let's do something. And my colleague Doug Kerr and I put together this group called People for Ontario's New Sex Ed. It started off as parents, then we opened it up to people because everyone cared, and it became 11,000 people in a week. So my name is Rabia Murtaza, and I was born in 1977 in Toronto, which was a very different Toronto than today's, in Jane and Finch. And some of my earliest memories are of snow and playing with my siblings. I have 3 siblings, and one came after me. And I remember a kind of very sheltered life, and then starting kindergarten. So we lived in a building which had a lot of diversity, and so there were lots of kids from Vietnam coming at that time, and lots of West Indian kids, lots of black kids, and there were a lot of languages. So it's kind of this like very happy feeling of a square filled of like really diverse kids. I think it creates a kind of comfort that's bone deep with people. You know, you just get used to the smells of different cooking, different kinds of intonations, and you know, people's mums calling loudly across the square, and like lots of expressions for now or no. But I also remember racism. So just, I think even before kindergarten, where I had a fight with a really good friend, and she said, you know, Packy. And I turned to my parents and I said, what do I say? She said, Packy. And my parents said, Bak means pure. Tell her that she's calling you pure. So I kind of shouted this like complicated analysis back to her across the square. So my parents, my father had moved to Canada from England in the early 60s, and he'd only been in England I think a few years before that. He'd originally come from Pakistan. And my mother came in 1971. So by the time I joined their life, you know, they had been in Canada quite a while. They were established. My father worked as an engineer. And I think I see I see many threads through my family, my extended family, which are that my relatives are artistic, they're political, and there is also a very conservative thread. And I think that those threads are also in my nuclear family. Yeah, it's very interesting to think about how my awareness of being Pakistani has changed over time. I think that it is, in the early years, shaped a little bit by, like within the family, it was sort of unconscious. It was like just unreflective. This is what we do, this is what we eat. You know, we only ate desi food, and we spoke a mix of Urdu and English, and heard a lot of Punjabi. I think outside of the home, my awareness of it was through racism. So siblings being egged on the way to school. And even in kindergarten, I remember there were two little girls who were brand new to Canada, and they were from India side, Punjab, and their first language was Punjabi. And one of them didn't speak any English yet. She was so lost, and so she found a friend who spoke Punjabi and English. And during story time, they were intensely speaking to each other in Punjabi, and the teacher thought it was me. And she said, she, you know, had said several times to stop. Those girls didn't stop. I know why now as a teacher, right? And she said, so she kind of landed on me and said, stop, and put me in the corner. And I protested and said, I don't even speak that language. And she said, oh, I know the lies your kind comes up with. So it's interesting when I look back at what I thought I would be when I was very young. We had a young West Indian woman living with us who I had a particular bond with. And somehow in this relationship, she saw that I would be a writer. And that was, you know, that meant something important. That so I don't know how I knew this at 7, that I wanted to be a writer. And then as I grew up, you know, I wrote some pretty terrible things that kind of read like Charles Dickens by a young Pakistani girl. and we moved to Pakistan at 7, when I was 7. And we were there until I was around 11. And I remember about midway, in my time there, I had read everything I could reach in this small one-room library, and I was sort of hungering for more books, and I was walking home one day, and I said, I'm never going to be a writer, because I don't know a single British flora or fauna, and I don't know how to ride a horse. And everything I had read was from the perspective of the landed gentry in Britain, 100 years prior. So I think that as a planet, we're facing knowledge about what's coming, which is intolerable. And under intolerable circumstances, people scapegoat, and they're scapegoating the generation which is most directly getting impacted by these intolerable things. So when there's a narrative about millennials which is full of contempt, I see victim blaming. And because my direct, extensive experience with people in that generation is of people who've internalized and act out empathy in a far more sophisticated and nuanced manner than any other generation that I've ever worked with. I see people who care about society, and they make choices based on a more holistic sense of themselves and other people, which to someone who hasn't done that looks like someone being flaky. But it's actually something that's, it's a more sophisticated worldview.
So the editor sent me to Islamabad, and Islamabad was the federal capital, and so there's a hierarchy in journalism. The established journalists turned to cover the parliament, the Supreme Court, the politics. And then I was at the bottom of the totem pole, so they said, go and do the human interest stories. That's the story that no one else would go and cover. So that was the best thing that happened to me, because I got a clean slate. The first interview I did was that of Hans von Sponik. Hans von Sponik was the country director, Pakistan director for UNDP, who happened to be the UNDP director for Iraq later. He was the one who actually told the world how the Western sanctions had destroyed Iraq, where the school children didn't have pencils because lead could not be imported into Iraq. And from there, so meeting with people like Hans von Sponik, who explained how human development matters. He said, don't build schools because that's money wasted on brick and mortar. Spend money on school teachers. Find a way to get school teachers to kids, but don't waste money on schools, because brick and mortar will not deliver education. So very basic concepts that people fail to understand, and I didn't understand that. So I was able to meet people like him. I was able to cover stories, and there's a Holy Family or a polyclinic, one of the two hospitals, I can't remember the name. And one day someone told me that there was a child who was stillborn at night, so they left the dead body on the bed, on the operation theater, and when the next day when the cleaning staff arrived, they heard someone crying. So they looked at the child that they left for dead was alive, and she remained alive in winter in an unheated room. So I covered her story as to what a phenomenal first night that child had on the most vulnerable night of her life, and she survived on her own. And so stories like this. There was another very interesting story. This was a story where a woman who was a domestic worker, an older woman, about 60 years old, was working at a house as a cleaning person and was walking back to her place. And as she was crossing over the railway lines where there was a protest against the military regime going on, the police started firing tear gas shells. And one of the shells landed on her head and killed her. And then next morning I read the news in the other newspaper saying she died of natural causes. So I went to her house, spoke with her adult children, and they revealed, they said, look, the magistrate came, and he said, either you file a complaint and deal with the government, or fight with the government, or here's some rupees, maybe 2,000 rupees, I think. So that's a story I wrote, and I still remember the first paragraph was, a magistrate can pay $2,000 to make a death sound natural. Right, University of Peshawar, where I was studying engineering. there was the Peshawar University, the Engineering University, the Khyber Medical College, and the Agriculture University, and the Islamic University, and Islamia College, and parts of the university were taken over by the jihadi enterprise. With the recruiting ground, all the beachheads were coming from all sorts of madrasas and colleges and universities. It was a very tough place to be. Under General Zia, growing up in Pakistan meant that you did not have much civic liberties. I remember going to the barber shop for a haircut, and it said there in every barber shop, political discourse strictly forbidden. In Urdu it said, "Yahan siyasi guftagoo karna mana hai." So this journey involved two dimensions. One was journalism, and the other one was a sort of a romantic interest as well. And I met a Canadian woman in Pakistan, and she was working on her thesis. And we kept in touch, and eventually decided that it's more than just keeping in touch. And obviously, at that time in Pakistan, no sane person would migrate from Canada to Pakistan to settle there. So the options were fairly limited. It was just for me to give up what I had there and move and start afresh here. So after I finished my engineering in Peshawar, I was very fortunate to be involved with journalism. I was writing for newspapers as a student, and one of the editors of the Frontier Post paper, which was a phenomenal paper at that time in Pakistan, was the only paper that people would read in North America or Europe to find out what's happening in Afghanistan. And Aziz Siddiqui said, are you going to be building bridges, roads, or are you going to write? I said, I want to write. So he said, go and report at the Islamabad Bureau. So I went and reported at the Islamabad Bureau. I was a journalist, and then at that moment when I decided, okay, I have to move to Toronto, and then I started looking to places of study, and I found Ryerson had a good journalism program. So I got into the magazine journalism program here. Very fortunate to study with some very amazing Canadian journalists. Charles Oberdoff was my professor. I learned a lot of copy editing from Cynthia Browse, who was the copy editor for Maclean's at that time. Some very, very accomplished Canadians were teaching in the program, and I was able to get my window and context into the journalism program. So that sort of brought me to Toronto. Now, I got very poor grades in the program, primarily because I arrived in Canada thinking I'm a journalist. I wrote for newspapers in Pakistan. I know English. It turned out that I didn't know English. The unfamiliarity with the idiom was not obvious to me until I landed at Ryerson. That there is an English idiom, and the way it's written in the North American context was very, very helpful. Look, if you look around books in my office, they are on statistical analysis, econometrics, and engineering. That's pretty much every book in this office. But if you look around, you'll also see pieces of art, books on Oriental rugs, books on cities like Paris. There's a section of books on history, small sections, but mostly everything else is mechanical. I think there's a part of me that wants to be connected deeply with myself. It doesn't happen to me with the mechanical side of my life. It happens to me when I think about carpets and Oriental rugs, or look at painting. I think younger generations, regardless of where they are, they face challenges. And being a person of color, being a young woman, being a parent and child of immigrants would impose some additional constraints in Canada, which are not as acute as the challenges you would face in Pakistan or the environment in which I grew up, where civil liberties did not exist and where all sorts of normal behavior, going to a date was almost risking your life. So here, if you are in that situation, you're a person of color, you're in your teen, and you have limited means, and your parents are immigrants, and they're still struggling to find their place. So you may find it to be a challenging to deal with all of this at the same time. But you should know that you're at a very good place. You cannot be at a better place. Right? You are in Toronto, you are in Montreal, you are in Vancouver, you are in Canada. The realization that and the desire to build an inclusive society is very strong in Canada. Now, you have to decide how you will find your own place in this crowd. Right? Noon Mim Rashid, I go back to poetry. Noon Mim Rashid said, "Ajtaha mein insan se fard ki lawai, zaat ki sadai, rahe shauq mein jaise rahro ka khoon." He said that in this immense crowd, from this immense crowd, an individual's voice could be heard.